There's no perfect answer. You can ask my opinion about something and another Indigenous person from another place will have a totally different opinion. But what it is about at the core is how you approach that and how you approach learning, listening, and reflection.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce MacDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our supporting partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. As the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation approaches on September 30th, many nonprofit organizations are preparing statements, hosting events, or pausing operations to honor the day. These actions are positive steps, but real reconciliation requires more and must go beyond symbolic gestures. In this episode, we're honored to be joined by two influential voices who challenge settler-led organizations to dig deeper. Justin Wiebe, a Red River Métis changemaker at the Mastercard Foundation, focuses on systems change grounded in Indigenous knowledge. Justin brings years of experience working alongside Indigenous communities and youth and is deeply committed to reimagining philanthropy and social impact through a decolonial and relational lens. And Alejandro Mayoral Banos is the founder of Indigenous Friends, an organization using technology to amplify Indigenous youth voices and build bridges between knowledge systems. Alejandro is also the executive director of Access Now, a global nonprofit organization that defends and extends the digital rights of people and communities at risk. Welcome to both of you. So glad you could join us here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Bruce.
So we'll kick things right off with a little bit of kind of an opener question. Many nonprofit organizations want to do something for September 30th. What's your message to settler-led nonprofits about where to begin? So maybe, Alejandro, we'll start with you.
Yes, of course. And I always drive a lot of our efforts in three main pillars when we are engaging with Indigenous peoples. One is to listen and build meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities and peoples. Invest time, resources, and knowledge to really knowing more about the community and about their members. Really create that community sense of belonging and create meaningful and truthful relationships. Commonly, people don't want to invest in the relationships. They just want to jump into action. But it's so important to create these relationships when we are talking about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous ways of knowing. I think this is a key element that sometimes very bureaucratic organizations really struggle with, especially big academic institutions or big non-for-profits. Sometimes they ask themselves, what is the methodology in order to engage with Indigenous peoples? But I think this is a part of the community values that are fostered with that human approach and that connection, a deep connection at the individual level, at the community level. And that brings an important aspect that is giving back to the community. It's always like if you belong to the community, you want to foster that community. It's not just about personal gains or organizational gains, but how we're going to foster those relationships. That is the first one. The second one is support Indigenous-led orgs and initiative, not just on September 30th. I think we have that understanding that just because it's Truth and Reconciliation Day, that is the day that we need to invest the resources and focus our attention to Indigenous orgs. But I think throughout the year, there are a lot of ways to engage. Of course, buying from Indigenous orgs and getting suppliers from Indigenous organizations is a good way. Also, collaborate with Indigenous organizations in medium and long-term relationships. I have seen so many times that we just need that approach or that action on September 30th or throughout the month of September, and we finish the relationship. Why we are just thinking in this way and we are not thinking in the long term? And finally, and the third pillar is the foster Indigenous representation in different spaces. But it's not about just numbers and having more staff. It's not at the base level, but also at the decision level. How many organizations are really allowing Indigenous peoples to take a leadership role in their organizations to make decisions? to change things. And that is a very different approach from just increasing the numbers of Indigenous representation, how Indigenous peoples are going to be able to make decisions. So recap, listen and build meaningful relationships, support Indigenous-led orgs and initiatives, not just on September 30th. And third, foster Indigenous representation in different spaces.
Yeah, these are great points to really remind folks who are listening. And I think this one around the fact that this is a year-round, ongoing commitment. And yes, while it's great to sort of shine a spotlight every September 30th, that it's so much more than this. It's not just one day of action, one day of attention, but it's really a change in the way we work. And maybe we'll kind of switch to that in terms of how we work. Much of the nonprofit sector operates within colonial frameworks. And achieving lasting change means challenging the very systems that we work within. So, Justin, from your systems change lens, what structures in the nonprofit sector need to be rethought if reconciliation is going to be real and lasting?
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Alejandro, for kicking us off. I think there's so much truth in what you shared, Alejandro, that really sort of links to how we need to do transformative work to shift the way that the sector functions and works. And so, at the forefront for me, listening and learning. For the nonprofit sector, it's about, and that can only happen from a place of good relationship, of partnership, of co-creation. And so that place of starting from relationship and partnership before you jump to doing something or jump to the solution. I'm fortunate in my work. I get to work really closely with amazing Indigenous organizations across the country, Indigenous leaders transforming mainstream universities, nonprofits, charities, and they're doing work that is both systemic, but also practical. It's easy sometimes to get lost in systems change, thinking it's these very complex and difficult shifts. And that can be the case. But system change can also be very practical. It can be the things and the ways in which people work and the relationships that exist. And sometimes it's as simple as taking the time to understand, to build connections, and to go from there. And so two of the main things I see, in the work and in the organizations that I'm fortunate to be in partnership with and listen and learn alongside is how do you meaningfully integrate, include, and uplift Indigenous voices. And as Alejandro said, this is, at all levels of an organization and across the sector. It's in decision-making roles, it's in leadership, and it's also recognizing the unique expertise that Indigenous people generally bring, both about our lived experience, our lived realities, as well as what our people need, but also our knowledge systems hold answers to challenges that all people face. And in particular, I'm fortunate in the work that I do to work really closely with young people, Indigenous young people across the country. And so I also think we need to think intergenerationally as well about where we look for expertise, where we look for guidance, and where we look for insight. And so I see the wisdom and expertise that, of course, our elders hold, folks who've been around the block a few times like Alejandro and I, but also those young people who are coming up and are sort of uninhibited by the bureaucracy and the systems that we've sort of been forced to work in. And so I think there's expertise and wisdom in the vision that young people hold. I work in the philanthropy side of sort of the nonprofit and charitable sector. And so, for me, there's also a need to invest abundantly in Indigenous-led solutions. Like we can and are building systems that work for us, and that will work for other people. But we also know the funding gap is real. And so we need to look and invest abundantly and from a place of trust. And so I think when we look to elevate and uplift Indigenous expertise across generations, when we put our sort of money where our mouth is about recognizing the wisdom and solutions that Indigenous people have, that's where those solutions to shift systems come from. And so, one example, I think, really, really practical. If folks are not aware of this organization, they're called a Nauma Community Foundation, an Inuit-led community foundation, only a few years old now, working in Nunavut. And so taking a model of a community foundation, but really grounding it in the unique context, the unique region, and Inuit expertise to do grant making. So they've built new systems of grant making that are grounded in ancient knowledge systems and in old ways of doing things. And so they're really bringing together a structure like a community foundation with Inuit decision making, which is really about consensus. And so, they've built a new model or an old model, depending on how you look at it, of philanthropy that brings people to the table to make decisions about where money goes together. And so I think there's tremendous wisdom in people who are building new systems. It's not just about shifting what we currently have. It's also about envisioning and building new that is grounded in expertise in place in Indigenous knowledge. And so, there's organizations like Inauma across the country that are saying, hey, this way that we've been working as a sector, as philanthropy or in charity isn't working for us very well. But we have some ideas about what would work better. And so for those like me in the funding space, it's how do we get behind that? How do we invest in that vision and enable organizations like Inauma and others to build and to vision and to make it real?
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's interesting that you mentioned Inauma because we've been fortunate to have them on as guests on the podcast to talk about some of their approaches. And I have to say, based on Justin, you and Alejandro, that if you've both been around the block a couple of times, I've been around the neighborhood a few times because I think you're talking about young people and there's already a difference here. So, but it's interesting, both of you have really kind of leaned into this idea of solid, authentic relationships and co-creation. We're going to maybe go a little bit deeper here because too often Indigenous engagement is limited to one-off consultations. There's this deeper opportunity in building relationships grounded in equity and mutual respect. And Alejandro, we're going to come to you on this one because your work combines tech and Indigenous knowledge. So what can settler organizations learn about co-creation versus simply consultation?
Oh, thank you for this question. There is a lot that we can talk about around this question, and especially with all the threats that we are seeing right now in the digital ecosystem. And I think the change in the world now that is happening across the globe, it's very good evidence of when things go not in the right direction, I would say. And there is an opportunity to learn from Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledge systems. I think there is a big opportunity for the philanthropic sector to learn from Indigenous knowledge systems. But there is an investment because you need to deconstruct yourself. You need to learn how to do things in a completely different way and how we can start rebuilding these systems, including Indigenous ways of knowledge. And this is not just as a way to indigenize the non-for-profit sector or the tech sector, but I think it's way deeper, how we can decolonize and how we can bring those ethical communal values into the design of the technology. And I think we are missing that piece. But in order to bring that, of course, we need more representation. We need Indigenous peoples to be the designers, the decision makers, in order to include these points of view and these ways of knowing into the tech ecosystem. And how we can continue reimagining a lot of the different technologies that we have in front of us. And we have been trying to do through the Indigenous Friends Association, and now in my global role, trying to go to the global level, how we can focus more those grassroots efforts to the global scale, and especially how these local Indigenous ways of knowing, these grassroots ways of knowing can bring a lot of understanding to the big tech platforms. There is a lot of things that at the community level that already a lot of elders, knowledge keepers have figured out about, for example, content moderation. How, when there is discrepancies in the communities, in the same communities, how we can bring people together, how we can create a circle, how we can move forward, bringing these perspectives in conflict resolution, for example. How, in a more community-based approach of leadership, how instead of having hierarchy that is a vertical way of decision-making is more as a circle, and how even those structures can be replicated in the digital space in order to make decisions about censorship, for example. So there is a lot of important opportunities happening, and even with the conversation about AI, like how these Indigenous ways of knowing can actually shape a lot of how we are regulating AI and how AI can bring that community focus, and how it's so important that we connect all these conversations about tech with the environment. Because from Indigenous ways of knowing, we cannot be detached from Mother Earth, from the land. So how it's so important to bring these Indigenous ways of knowing, to bring the environment as a crucial part of the design of technology. And I think so many times we get lost on that conversation. We are just thinking about the profit and how you are going to become the biggest, newest startup. But that is not a community approach. How actually the benefit of this specific technology is going to bring forward the entire community, and how we're going to bring the land and the environment into that design. And I think we are missing that part. And there is several organizations that are trying to move that forward. For example, Aminiki in Vancouver, that are bringing this perspective and this community lenses into the design of technology. But I think it's very important that we can continue fostering the younger generations to get a role in the design of technology. I think younger generations, they have the opportunity to connect ancient practices with the technology, and how we can foster a lot of the solutions for a lot of the challenges that we have ahead of us.
These are some great examples of how this change can take place. And I think we probably spent a whole podcast on how that would work, especially in the technological and AI space. But we will move on because we've got more questions to ask. And just, I'm going to come back to you on this one, because as we are thinking about this around this sort of spotlight of September 30th, there are many charitable and nonprofit organizations who are looking intentionally at what they do. But even with good intentions, organizations frequently repeat harmful patterns. So recognizing these patterns is essential to doing better. So from what you've seen, what are some of the most common missteps that settler organizations or nonprofits make when trying to engage in reconciliation work?
I mean, I just want to pick up a couple things just on co-creation as well that Alejandro was sharing, because I think it connects to this, and it's important. And I think where it connects to the missteps as well. Co-creation at the core is about, for me anyways, recognizing the expertise and wisdom at the community level, that people know what they need. And the challenge has been for a number of reasons, whether that be because of resources, because of access, because of decisions made by other people, those solutions are not been able to be realized. And so, at the core for nonprofits who are exploring how to live out reconciliation on September 30th and, all year round, is starting from that place of sort of recognizing where the solutions, where the expertise, where the knowledge is, and to approach that from a place of trust and humility. I think that's a fundamental. If you're going to do co-creation, any action that you're going to take on September 30th or all year round for sort of a non-Indigenous nonprofit needs to be grounded in humility, recognizing that one, you might get it wrong, and that's okay. And then how do you respond to that? Because too often still we see nonprofits, but this is not just a nonprofit sector sort of challenge, but outsiders thinking they know what's best for our people, or they know what the solutions are. And so I think when you approach things from that place of humility, it's a recognition that you actually don't know. And your role is to figure out how to be a meaningful partner and to support the solutions that Indigenous people have. I think that's a core piece of both the co-creation, but also where we continue to see patterns of misstep or error. And so I think, there's a few kind of core principles that I try to live by and encourage others, humility being one of them. We've probably all heard it before that, the saying, nothing about us without us, I think is a core piece of this as well, right? Is not doing things in a vacuum and disconnected for sort of selfish motivations, but recognizing that if you're reconciliation at the core is about a rebuilding and a reestablishing of an equitable relationship, and one that recognizes harm and recognizes where solutions can come from. And so I think that's a core piece. No sort of nonprofit can do this themselves. They can't do this, in isolation from Indigenous communities. And so it's about listening. It's about learning, and it's about doing this work together. So, encourage nonprofits to not also be scared, because I think that's another thing that we see sometimes is people can get lost in wanting to be perfect or do the exact right thing. In my opinion, that's actually not what is needed, or that's not what this is about. There's no perfect answer. You can ask my opinion about something, and another Indigenous person from another place will have a totally different opinion. But what it is about at the core is how you approach that and how you approach learning, listening, and reflection. when you do make an error. We're all going to make errors, and that's not the problem. The problem is when we do something wrong, when we cause harm, or we make a mistake, we don't learn from it, we don't apologize, or we don't do something different next time. So I think, there's lots of things that people might do, and it can be intimidating, it can be scary, but I encourage people to do things, to reach out, to build connections, to build relationships, but to also know that you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And it's about how you respond to those mistakes.
Yeah. And Alejandro, I'm going to invite you to jump in on this one too.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are three things that I see common mistakes when non-for-profits work with Indigenous communities. First, and Justin already touched a little bit on that, is that Indigenous communities are different and they have different opinions. And trying to put everyone under the umbrella of Indigenous as an homogeneous voice, it can be a very big mistake. So not acknowledging the difference among different Indigenous nations, it's a very important thing that non-for-profits need to be aware. And a project that can be very beneficial in one community and can be accepted in one community can be very different in the other. So knowing the differences among Indigenous communities and really investing time to create those authentic relationships in each of them. The second one is this approach that I think this is in general with the philanthropic sector, the idea of the fiscal year, that everything is going to be performed under one fiscal year and all our cycles are around fiscal years. But in systemic change and when you are working with Indigenous communities, you are not working with around fiscal years. So sometimes the design of programs, the design of projects are very tied to that idea of the fiscal year. So how we can challenge the system, and I think this is more on the philanthropic sector side, how we can start rethinking the system in a way that is more connected to the communities and allowing a lot of the work to really develop authentic relationships that we were talking about, but how also we can start measure the impact in the long term and really having the input from the communities. Sometimes an action might not have the effect that we thought. And just to have that conversation and that feedback from the community, that takes time. But sometimes because we have the fiscal year, we need to have all these results and reports in this cycle. Sometimes it's very different. And the third point that I would say, and already Justin mentioned it a little bit briefly, but now I'm witnessing that a lot in the global and local level, is that we as international NGOs, sometimes we try to put global issues as everyone has this issue and putting everyone under the same umbrella without actually considering the local or regional priorities. So sometimes it's so important to have those nuances when we are creating our plans. Maybe it's something that we want to do in a specific local community. It might not be applicable to the entire region or even at the national level. So it's so important that we start acknowledging those aspects when we are doing our planning and when we are even designing our projects or even our strategic vision. So I think this is an important aspect in order to avoid harmful practices in the non-for-profit sector.
Yeah, these are such interesting comments. I'm really quite struck with this idea that there may be organizations or individuals who still think they know what is needed. I mean, so many of the comments that both of you have made have really spoken directly to this idea of authentic relationships and co-creation. It strikes me that based on your observations that we still have a ways to go in terms of some of the relationships that are being put forward right now. So I'm going to ask both of you this question. Alejandro, we'll start with you. And I think this is a tough question. So what are the hardest but most necessary questions that white leaders and settler organizations should be asking themselves right now in this moment in time?
Okay. I think one important one is I'm still thinking that I'm a white savior. I'm still thinking that I'm saving communities. If I'm still in that mentality, it's important to start doing a very deep reflection of why I'm doing what I'm doing. What I have found is sometimes a lot of non-for-profit leaders, they still believe that they are saving people. And this idea of, oh, I'm more powerful than you and I'm going to save you. for recognition, for guilt, for whatever reason. But I think doing that reflection is so important moving forward, because in order to have an authentic relationship, I need to see you as equal. And if I'm not going to be challenging that part on my beliefs, that is going to be a very big struggle. The second part that is connected to that is who holds power in my organization. And I'm not talking about the structures. I'm not talking about like, oh, the board of directors. No, sometimes it's like, who is that stronger voice in the organization that is making a lot of the decisions? And third is, what is the decision-making process in my organization? What about if Justin doesn't agree with me? What is the process to have that disagreement? Is there any space for that disagreement to happen? Is there a way that things can be challenged? If not, I think there is a problem. There is a problem because then you are not listening. And if you are not listening internally, how you are going to listen to communities outside? So those are my 3 key questions that I could ask non-for-profit leaders.
Yeah, thanks, Alejandro. I mean, I think I feel very similarly. I think the first fundamental question is why, and sort of why am I, as a leader in an organization, interested in reconciliation? Why am I pursuing hosting an event or doing something for September 30th? Why? And to really be candid with themselves as leaders and with their teams to really dig into that, because I think if you dig into the why behind something, it can be incredibly helpful to understand what are the actual motivations. What is the rationale or decision making, or who ultimately is what you're trying to do for. Unfortunately, I think we've both come a long way as a sector in some ways, but we still have a long way to go. And I think even the most well-intentioned people, if you dig far enough by asking why a few times, it can be incredibly illuminating and can really challenge some of the core rationale for decisions that are being made. And I think this is it's a good thing to do. It'll make the decisions that people make stronger. It will make the work that they do more impactful. It might be a little uncomfortable, but in that discomfort is the space for growth and learning, right? And so, I think at the fundamental level, talking to white leaders and, others in the sector, it's why are you really doing this? Who is it and who is it for? And I think that's a core piece. I think another question that I think leaders, any leader, but, particularly in this conversation about reconciliation, is to reflect on and ask yourself, when is the last time that someone gave you feedback, as a leader? I think the reality of how many organizations function, and I think as we move our way up hierarchies and end up leading organizations and all these things, the feedback mechanisms tend to be one way, as you become a leader, right? As you move up the chain, you're the one who's giving feedback to others. And I think when you're able to be open to how you receive feedback from your staff, from your community partners, that can be also incredibly illuminating. We all have blind spots. They're all things that we as individuals may not be aware of. Some of those things may be obvious to others and maybe they should be obvious to the person, but the reality is they might not be. And so it's only through, in my opinion, feedback like that leaders can improve, can be better. I believe, the leadership across the nonprofit sector is committed to building a better society, is generally, committed to truth and reconciliation, wants to build a Canada, a country, a society, a world that is better for more people. I believe that to the core. But I think, we're human beings. We have egos. We have blind spots. But I think when we have right relations, as we've talked about, a bunch, when we build those open, candid, trusting relationships with any partner, but in this conversation, particularly Indigenous partners, where conversation can be about what's working, but also what's not working, we can get a lot further. So that's my sort of advice for leaders is, building good relationships and get feedback and ask yourself why a whole bunch of times.
This is so helpful. And it's interesting, that question was really framed around the leaders themselves. And we're going to switch it now more to the organizations and what they need to do to get started. Because it's interesting, as we head into September 30th, this idea of creating more attention for what is hopefully an ongoing or regular interaction and engagement, this is an opportunity. And presumably, and certainly I think your remarks Both of you today have illuminated the fact that many organizations are at different places along a continuum of, kind of this journey, if you will. And as we think about maybe some of those who are closer to the beginning, what foundational work needs to happen internally before engaging externally? And maybe Justin, will start with you, and then Alejandro, if you can just jump in and pick it up, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I kind of in some ways want to take us back right to the beginning. The first question about people want to do something on September 30th. And I think that's great. I think one, we have to harness energy that's well-intentioned and directed towards doing good. But I think the starting place is a place of listening and learning, So I think that's it. I think, well-intentioned, progressive people, when we learn a little bit, I'm going to get this wrong, but there's this whole kind of thing about the more we know or we realize the less that we know or something like that. I'm confusing it a little bit, but this idea when people learn a little bit, so a well-intentioned organization person, they're like, oh, the TRC, September 30th. Yes. It's important that we do something. That's great. But sometimes when you know a little bit, you think you actually have solutions to something that is incredibly complex and big. And, we're talking about 150 years of things. And, it's much bigger than what one person or one organization can do. And so I think it's starting from that place, again, of humility, of listening, of building good relationships and good partnerships. That will be the place where you draw inspiration about what the role of an organization is. I think often organizations early in their journeys really want to jump to the solution that they think they have. And I really caution people around that, because I think on the surface, it can feel like it is the right thing to do. So take an organization, they're on their learning journey. It doesn't really matter what sector they're working in, but often the first solution is, oh, we don't have any Indigenous programs. We need to start a new Indigenous program on X. That sounds like a great idea, on the surface. But the reality is what they haven't done is they haven't paused, thought about, are we the right organization to do that? Do we know what are the Indigenous organizations that are already doing this work? And how could we actually be a supporter and partner to those existing organizations? So I think the first idea that many organizations who are early on in their journey have is we need to create a whole new thing that's like an Indigenous thing for us to do. And there are times when that might be the right thing, but I think often it's actually not. And the right thing for those organizations to do is to understand who else is in their ecosystem, who else is doing similar work to them. I guarantee 9 times out of 10, there's an Indigenous organization that already exists, that's probably already working in that space, and that they would bring value to you and you could bring value to them. And that's a better use of everyone's time. And at the core, what it is really about, it's actually better for the young people, the Indigenous community members, the folks who are accessing and need to access program support services that will improve and help improve their lives. An ecosystem, a sector that is more coordinated, that has better relationships, that's more collaborative, that's going to be better for everyone versus one where, oh, there's an Indigenous organization that's been doing this work for 20 years, and then this organization that just learned something pops up tomorrow and starts something new. That's actually not very helpful. That's an advice I get. I'm sure, Alejandro, it's the same. We get asked by leaders in the sector all the time, what can they do? Or they have this idea, we saw a piece of data or we read the TRC again, and it's like, oh, there's a gap here. We need to do something. My caution is always, well, who else is doing this? Who do you not know? Because do you know this person that I know? I've never heard of them. Well, then you actually haven't done the homework yet. So I think, in short, it's about for organizations early in their journey, don't get ahead of yourselves. It's great you want to do something. We all have a responsibility to do something, but that thing that you think you're going to do when you first learn is probably not the right thing to do over the long term. And there's tremendous Indigenous leaders, Indigenous organizations in our sector doing awesome work. I think that is a big change in the last 10 years is, when I started in the nonprofit sector, I don't think there was nearly as many Indigenous people in this space. So there's more of us here. We have our own organizations that are growing and doing impactful work. And we're open to working with others because we recognize other people are bringing other things to the table. And those ideas, solutions that we can build together are going to be better than anything we can do in silos or alone.
On my side, Bruce, I think, of course, Justin already mentioned this one, but it's listening and learning. That's the first step. First, listen, learn more about it, learn about the history, learn. And I think a lot of organizations, sometimes they are redirecting staff or volunteers, go to this website and just learn about it, but go invest more. Like how much you are really willing to invest to bring someone to actually create that meaningful relationship and being able to answer questions. Because I have been facing a lot of times that after reading all these materials, people have questions. They want to also engage with the material. So there are tons of organizations out there that do this type of training. So invest in that listening and learning. The second point would be a reflection on leadership and accountability. And then I think it's how the decisions are made within my organization and who are the decision makers. Am I allowing people to disagree with me? And what are the tools in case that someone disagrees with me? How I'm more accountable to the communities we serve. And I think one important question that always elders are bringing this up to all of us when we are in those teachings with them is, what are your intentions? And really, as an organization, what is your intention bringing an Indigenous program to life? Is it because marketing purposes, because it's September 30th and we need to have something around Indigenous communities in our website to bring more donors? So that is not an authentic relationship or an authentic purpose. So you don't care about communities. So this is an important reflection in the organizations why you want to open an Indigenous program. Third, and we have been talking about this throughout the podcast, has been about investing in long-term relationships. If I'm going to do an investment and I already made the reflection that I really want to start an Indigenous program, am I willing to invest this in the long term? And as we Justin said, what are the collaboratives that I can create in order to deliver this work? There are already tons of organizations, tons of freelancers, Indigenous freelancers that are out there doing the work, how we can collaborate together in order to make this program better. And I think sometimes there is that hesitation to start a collaboration because, I want all the resources, but then it's going back to the reflection piece. So why are you doing this work? Are you doing this work just for the resources? Then I think it's a bigger conversation. And I think you need to be careful because if not, you're going to be extracting resources again from Indigenous peoples. And finally, how you are investing in really having Indigenous peoples within your team. But it's not just about a hiring practice of, let's hire an Indigenous person and that is going to be the work to be done. I think there is a lot of things that organizations need to change in order for Indigenous peoples to really succeed in the roles. It's not just about hiring them and that's it. How we are changing the systems within our organization to actually allow people to, foster their skill sets and actually thrive within the roles. And I think there is a lot of reflections and a lot of things that we need to change internally in order to allow to Indigenous peoples to thrive in these organizations. And I think these 4 practices, listen and learning, the reflection, building long-term relationships, and bringing more Indigenous talent into the workforce are very key in moving forward.
Yeah, it really occurs to me as I'm listening to both of your comments that on this question about, organizations getting started internally, it's this idea of not taking a big leap to solutions and programs, but rather taking baby steps to relationships and understanding. Like it seems to be central to all the comments that both of you have made. So last question, and this is one that we end our podcasts on all the time. So Alejandro, we'll start with you. What gives you hope when it comes to the future of reconciliation and its relationship to the nonprofit sector?
I think the non-for-profit sector right now is in crisis because the changes in the geopolitics, I think more than ever, the resources globally have decreased significantly. So I think I see a lot of hope of bringing these Indigenous ways of knowing in the way that we practice philanthropy around the world. How we can create real collaborations meaningful relationships where we are not competing against each other, but working as a community. I think there is a lot of learnings, a lot of teachings to learn from a lot of the resiliency that a lot of Indigenous communities have gone through. And I think the philanthropic sector will benefit a lot to learn from that. So I'm very hopeful for what is coming regarding that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I come across. Sometimes I may come across a bit pessimistic. I'm not sure, but I am optimistic for the sector and for the future in many ways. I mean, I think one of those reasons is I'm so fortunate to work alongside, Indigenous young people in the work that I do. And so that's where I get a lot of that optimism and hope for the future, because I see daily young people that are relearning their languages, despite residential schools and things that have taken our languages away. I see young people starting businesses that are thriving, that are grounded in who they are, and, hiring their community members and their peers. I see young people launching, new nonprofits or grassroots organizations to implement a whole bunch of ideas and solutions, in their communities and beyond. And so that's where I get inspiration from, and that's where my hope is drawn from, is seeing young people who, despite everything that they've experienced and that our people have experienced, are building for the future. So, I'm excited by that. I'm fortunate to see that every day. And the other side of it is I'm hopeful because it's been 10 years since the release of the TRC calls to action. Progress has been made, slow and still a long way to go, but people are still thinking and talking a lot about reconciliation. It hasn't disappeared. And, the colleagues, non-Indigenous colleagues in the sector that I interact with are continuing to learn, are continuing to explore how they can do more. And so, those non-Indigenous people in the sector that I get to spend time with and learn alongside, they're still committed. And so I think that's promising as well. Young people are building for the future. And, there's countless non-Indigenous allies that I see across the sector who are not afraid to stand up, not afraid to say what needs to be said, and are working towards reconciliation and a better society for all of us.
Well, thanks to you both. I mean, for me, what gives me hope is to hear your words of counsel and advice and provocation, really, in a way to invite sector leaders to be thinking about their work, not just around September 30th, but how can it infuse their day-to-day work going forward. So I want to take the opportunity to thank both of you, Justin and Alejandro, for joining us here on Let's Imagine. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to speak with me here today.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsor, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.